Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our lecture on who are the Canadian Indigenous people. My name is Adrienne, and I'm assistant curator here at the Niagara Falls History Museum. I'm going to start by reading our land acknowledgement, and then I have a short bio about Dr. Williamson, and then I will hand it over to her for tonight's topic. This webinar is being recorded, so for any of you that can't attend the whole thing or you want to share, we will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube page after, and it is being currently live streamed on our Facebook page, so you're more than welcome to share through there. That also being said, if you guys do have comments throughout the evening, please do put them in the chat, whether that be through the Zoom link here or on our Facebook live stream, as I will be monitoring everything in the background and putting your questions together for after, so we can have a nice Q&A at the end of the lecture. So please do stick around for that. So without further ado, the Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Chinootan peoples. The Chinootan peoples have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. So Dr. Williamson is a member of the Moose Deer Point First Nation and the Sturgeon clan. She was raised and returned to Minnedoosing, which traditionally we call it by the name of Manitoulin Island, in Ontario, where she currently resides with her husband of almost 43 years. It's very impressive. She has 3 adult children, a daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. Pamela attained her doctorate from OISE, University of Toronto, in administration, higher education. For over 10 years, Pamela was a professor, counselor, and administrator within the Indigenous departments of several Ontario community colleges. During that time, she published a book entitled First Nations People that has become required reading for most post-secondary students within some Indigenous studies, policy foundations, and other programs. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Pam. And once again, please do put your chats, your questions, your comments in the chat. And once again, it will be recorded live for future reference. All right, take it away, Pam.
Ani, hello, everyone. So I'm a little nervous. I have been doing presentations for a bit since I retired. It wasn't noted that for the last 15 years, I was an executive director of a primary healthcare organization that served Indigenous populations within the Manitoulin Island area, Metis. So I'm now doing the presentations for a number of different groups and many different topics. But I'm really finding that I prefer to do it in person. So I'm going to be starting with the presentation as of now. So the title was Indigenous, Canadian Indigenous People. Who are they? Who are we? And I know that there was a discussion about indicating that Indigenous people are Canadian. And we are without borders originally, historically, but I am only having this conversation and this presentation to deal with Indigenous people who are living within the territory or the land known as Canada. Did introductions. So overview of the presentation. This is kind of like a Reader's Digest version. I find that I'm going to be going through material really quickly. I know that there are areas that I'm not going to go into detail, but as you have questions, perhaps if we have time, I'd love to be able to respond to them, but it also may be another day's topic that we can note for later. So talking about Indigenous cultures across Canada, differences, commonalities, systems of government, protocol, and relationships to the Canadian levels of government. So the purpose of the presentation is to offer participants a greater familiarity about Indigenous cultures, including differences, shared qualities, and their unique relationship to the Canadian, to Canada and the provinces. to move together the collective commitment of recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And again, a lot of what I talk about is from my perspective as a First Nation person. And there are a number of other reports with recommendations that were also done with the Metis and with the Inuit. This particular reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation, was relating to residential schools. So the sources and citations have been noted. So they are put into the document, and I put some at the end as well. And anything that I've done that is from other original contributors is not intended to break copyright parameters. So again, I've tried to make sure that I've given recognition to anything that is not original material. And most of it is not original material. Any anecdotal information is offered from my personal experiences. So questions and discussions are encouraged, but are limited in keeping respect for the time allocated to the presentation. And the discourse is intended to be enlightening and to foster Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship building. Our communication together is also expected to remain mutually respectful and a positive learning environment. So the presentation focuses more toward First Nations and Indigenous people living within the boundaries of Canada. And again, given this is my area of expertise as a First Nation person. So I believe that I have, my computer crashed just before I started. So I am going to find that some of my slides are not the same ones that I have created in my final slide projection. So I'm going to keep going, but unfortunately, I'm just noticing this. So Indigenous people come from many different cultures. So we are not a homogenous group across Canada, but we are very many different peoples with many different languages, many different areas in which we've originally lived. And those borders that are Canada and the United States are really artificial and a recent boundary. So you will find Indigenous group that are the same living on both sides of the border. Indigenous people are the original peoples who have lived on the land known as Canada for a very long time. So just to give it a sense of perspective with a visual, there's different research that says, that they have located things from 12,000 years ago, and some say further back. For the Vikings, for example, they were here around 10,000, so maybe 1,000 years ago. And then European settlers were here within the last 400 to 600 years. So putting it in perspective, when I say the things about being original peoples, it is with that in mind to give it that sense of what a length of time we have been here. Indigenous peoples of the Americas historically and currently live across Turtle Island, west, north, east, and south, extending across the borders of the existing countries of North and South America. Indigenous cultures are probably diverse with many unique gifts and characteristics. Each culture possesses its own unique ways of living and being connected to Mother Earth. Indigenous people are recognized with having various degrees of rights by the Canadian government. So rights to the land, to subsistence resources and activities, to self-determination and self-government, to practice one's own culture, customs, including language and spirituality. I put the word religion because it was in the text that I had used. These rights are based on inherent and collective rights as being the original peoples and occupiers of the land, and from having existing societies and orders already here prior to European contact. So the words often used are time immemorial. So there are three distinct groups of Indigenous people that are recognized under the Canadian Constitution that was created in 1982. So First Nations, Metis, and Inuit. So I have also, this is one of the slides that I updated. So as I go along, I'm really hoping that I recall them. There was a total Indigenous population in Canada in 2016 of 1,670,000. And in 2021, the populations of Indigenous peoples increased to 1.8 million. So location of Indigenous populations by province and territory are, as you can see from this depiction graph, there is the least amount in Prince Edward Island and the most are found in Ontario. So Indigenous populations comprise of, as said, 4 to 5% of the Canadian population, and we remain the fastest growing populations in Canada. So breaking it down further between First Nation, Metis, and Inuit, First Nations comprise approximately 60% of the Indigenous populations, Metis 33%, and Inuit are approximately 4%. So again, I attempted to create, I was looking for visual depictions to give a sense of the diversities. This one is more to do with the languages that are across Canada of the Indigenous populations. And that was what I was attempting to show, was that there was a very strong diversity and it goes across every part of Canada. So some of the rights of Indigenous populations include non-insured health coverage. So there's coverage for things like drugs, dental, vision, medical supplies, equipment, mental health counseling, medical transportation, just to name a few things. Education from preschool up into post-secondary and trades, hunting, trapping, fishing, Indigenous owned lands or communities, and a number of other benefits can be seen at the Government of Canada site, and I've included a website link for that. Indigenous people are subject to all the same tax rules as Canadians, and this has been something that, in my experience, has been noted as a misunderstanding because it is often felt that Indigenous people all have tax exemption. So the only the only Indigenous group that has tax exemption are those who are tax exempt under Section 87 of the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is very specific to First Nations. And again, it is within specific parameters. So Indigenous groups are distinct with unique qualities and characteristics, as I've already mentioned, but very closely connected to the land on which they lived or live. The physical environment continues to play an important role as an integral part of their culture and life ways. So as you can see, I can see a mistake there. It says any instead of an, and those were some of the things that I have had made revisions to. So some of the things that they are unique to each group are things like their territory. So dealing with both what we had historically, and even as that we continue to use today and have as part of our uniqueness, it's protocols, languages and dialects, clothing, footwear, our spirituality practices, tools, implements, weapons, the way that we were socialized, and roles based on gender, age, and so on. The traditional medicines that we use, our governance, food and food preparation, transportation, teaching, stories, our homes, and many, many other unique differences and qualities. I was going to say something about, I think it was about, I'm just going to let that one go because my thought left me. So First Nations, if we're just looking at the First Nations, there are 630 First Nations representing 50 nations and 50 Indigenous language dialects across Canada. First Nation people live within their First Nation territories or within non-Indigenous communities across Canada. So that is just common for Indigenous populations, not only to be found in their historical traditional territories, but they also live where other Canadians live as well. Currently, more First Nations live outside of their community than within their First Nation, and in larger concentrations within specific urban centers. So again, I looked for a depiction just to be able to say where First Nations are, what are in this specific legend or this chart map, it shows different tribal councils as well. So again, you will note that First Nations people live well across Canada. So one of the things that what we are able to have as a First Nation person is First Nation person is legally recognized with the rights as a registered or treaty member of a specific First Nation. In keeping with this recognition, individual First Nation members have their own status card. So what I did was I pulled out I have an old card from a few years ago. Obviously, I don't look like that, darn it now. First Nations living both on and off reserve within a First Nation are included as part of the population of each First Nation. So our membership, I went on too quickly there. So the status card is something that I carry. I have my own number. I have my own, it identifies the number of my First Nation. And it is something that I am able to carry with me and to use for specific purposes. So when you are looking at the population of a First Nation, we are, as being a member of my First Nation, which is Moose Deer Point, I am able to be included in that membership. So the population of the membership of a First Nation includes both for off and those living on reserve and those living off of the community, outside of the community. And there is also a number to be able to say how many live within the community and then how many are living outside of the community. But they are all part of the same number in terms of the total membership. Status First Nations are the only Indigenous group eligible for tax exemption. So we are the only one with what is called a status card. The use of this right is dependent upon definition of their status under the Indian Act and whether they live on or off their First Nation. So I have a status of under the Indian Act of a Section 6, subsection 1, which is full status. I married a non-native, a non-Indigenous person. And as a result, our 3 adult children are considered a Section 6, subsection 1 within the Indian Act. And as a result of that, we both have different, both of us have different privileges within that. Tax exemption is mostly available to those living within the First Nation. And I say that it is more easily able to be used living within the community. Tax exemption is specific to goods and services purchased on a reserve, Indian reserve, and the terminology is from the Indian Act. And it is under legislation that we as First Nations or Indigenous populations are still referred to as Indian. Or in Indian settlements by an Indian band or a band empowered entity are exempt from taxation. So some of the things that we are tax exempt from the GST is food, clothing, furniture, gas, income tax if we are working on reserve, and so on. The other interesting thing about First Nations is that we are not required, First Nations are not required to deduct CPP, excuse me. And that is because, I'm not going to go into why that's because, but in order to be able to deduct CPP, it has to be something that the First Nation or the First Nation empowered entity has to apply for, and it has to be approved of by the whole group in order for CPP to be deducted for First Nation employees. Non-status or non-treaty First Nations. Non-status or non-treaty First Nation individuals are not registered on the Indian registry and are ineligible for a status card. The approval or otherwise of each person's status is based on a criteria that's set down within the Indian Act. So non-status individuals can identify as Indigenous or as status or as Indigenous or as First Nations, but they are not recognized with the same status or as a status or treaty First Nation member. They do not have access to the same rights, programs, services. As First Nations seek to have their own governance system, the First Nations will have the right to identify who is part of their membership. So getting into the next group, the Metis. The Metis are a distinct Indigenous people with a unique history, culture, language, and way of life. And based on the research that I went through, there are 8 Metis legislated settlements that are located in Alberta. Identified historic Metis communities exist within a number of provinces, and Metis people, again, live throughout Canada. Métis is a term used to identify the descendants of First Nation and European parentage. Métis began with a lengthy history originating in Western Canada. Within the Constitution, Métis encompass descendants, and it's of Métis European parentage. And again, that was something that I corrected. My apologies for the problems with my slides and it not being the most current one. So again, I had changed this to be able to show you where Métis are found in terms of Métis settlements. This is relating to their script commissions, and this was looking at the different treaties and the rights of Métis within those treaties. So again, it was to be able to just depict, to show you that Métis people were living across Canada, but in this situation that you will see that they're mostly living from Ontario over. To be legally identified as a Métis, as recognized by Canadian law, an individual must identify as a Métis person, be a member of a present Métis community, and have ties to a historic Métis community. Definition of proven historic ties includes the Métis person must be part of a formed, distinctive collective society, a social identity, live together in the same geographic area, and share a common way of life. So the rights of the individual Métis, federal government does not maintain a registry for Métis people. The Métis Nation National Council is comprised of provincial Métis nations from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. Individual Métis register with a local or provincial Métis association and need to meet the Métis eligibility requirements in order to become a member. They have a card that identifies individuals with Métis membership. And again, it's one of the Indigenous groups recognized under the Constitution. So Métis who are eligible to apply for a Métis Citizens Card are provided with specific rights, programs, and services. So they have, similar to the other Indigenous groups, the right to hunt, fish on traditional land, to run and hold offices or provincial government structures. Métis are provided with similar programs and services as available to other Indigenous groups as discussed. And there are no formally recognized Métis associations east of Ontario that I could find. And if I'm in error in that, it is my apology. I really did do some research on this, but there are Métis who identify as Métis, individuals who identify as Métis east of Ontario. So the Inuit are a culturally similar Indigenous group of people who originally lived and still live in the Arctic. They had their own dialects, practice, and ways of living unique to their groups and locations. There are 53 Inuit communities located in the 4 regions in northern Canada, and I'll show you the map shortly. Inuit people are also located in communities across Canada, and similar to the other 2 Indigenous groups, larger Inuit populations are found within urban centers such as Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, and so on. So this is the 4 groups of or regions where land claims were settled that are under the Inuit Nanangat, and that is very specific to the Inuit. And I'm not going to try to say the names because I feel that I'm being disrespectful, even though I did some practicing of them. So each of them have different agreements and conditions and what they, under their land claim settlements that I will talk about right now. So the Inuit became a self-governing people when they formed the Nanasut government in 2005. So I had other items here to discuss with you, and my apologies, but this is not my final PowerPoint presentation. So the relationships with Canada and Indigenous people is probably where I would like to keep a lot of the focus of my final part of this presentation. So Indigenous people were self-governing before European contact, having their own laws, their own cultures, languages, their social economic ways of living, their spirituality, and so many other life ways that were unique to them. So self-government, as a definition that I went looking for, is decision-making power resides in the hands of autonomous entities, a government under the control and direction of the inhabitants of a political unit rather than by an outside authority. So this was something that Indigenous people had. Since early contact, Indigenous groups entered into legally binding treaties, trade, and military alliances with the various European powers. So the Hudson's Bay Company, Britain, France, and so on. These legally binding documents were signed between entities recognized as equal, nation to nation, business partner to business partner. As non-Indigenous governments grew in power and influence within Indigenous territories, the nation-to-nation relationships degraded, and there was a shift in power. European powers became more paternalistic, with a focus on colonial domination. So the result was there was a severe loss to Indigenous autonomy, cultural ways, rights to their lands, land products, extreme marginalization, and then as they became citizens of Canada. The imposition and interference of foreign and non-Indigenous entities have had devastating results that continue to impact Indigenous people today. So this is one sentence that in itself, if we go into detail, it would take another presentation. And at this point, I am not going to be talking about all of the things relating to the Indian Act, residential school system, day school systems, and a whole lot of other policies and practices that really did contribute to devastating Indigenous populations. So the self-government today, so Indigenous people experience multi-layered issues as part of the vicious cycle. So as a result of the impact, many of the things that are known about Indigenous populations and their struggles, they are as a result of the impact of not being marginalized and the paternalistic responses to the government and the actions that were taken. So, and again, not going into these and not citing any of these things, but believe me, they can be cited. We continue to have the worst health conditions. I just did a presentation to a group recently on rheumatism, and I was unaware that rheumatoid arthritis affects 1% of the Canadian population, yet it impacts 5% of Indigenous people. And it not only affects us more, we have worse conditions. So again, it just seems like there are so many things that we are struggling with relating to our health. high mental health and addiction issues. We are in the lower economic brackets on average. We have the greatest risk of loss of culture and languages. There are languages with very, very few speakers, today that we are very concerned about. Lower educational attainment, higher violence and violent deaths, higher incarceration rates, and it just goes on from there. The issues are seen as a manifestation of the previous and historical abuses, marginalization, and is referred to historical or intergenerational trauma. So Indigenous people as individuals or groups have sought to fight or bring attention to Indigenous inequity. Such struggles or advocacy have taken place in many forms across Canada and over time. A positive development occurred in 1982 when Canada formally recognized the inherent right to self-governance of the three Indigenous groups, First Nations, Metis, and Inuit, within the Constitution Act. So what self-government meant at that time was not clearly formed. What it means to the three Indigenous groups today and to the government has been evolving since that time. So there's been a lot of process that has gone into creating better parameters in being able to say how those relationships will be working in terms of developing self-government. But the fact is that there is process and progress being made towards self-governance. So through historical treaties and modern agreements, the federal and provincial governments are working with First Nations, Métis and Inuit towards the transfer of lawmaking authority in many areas. So many of these have started over time. Programs, services, health, economic development and growth, laws and legislation, culture for sure, education, lands and asset management, hunting, fishing, gambling, and so on. And I wanted to, I had gone into greater detail, but what I was looking to be able to do, this was not necessarily a model, but this depiction of self-government is more like a process and how it is working and how it is continuing to move and change. So if you look at what self-government is and where it starts, well, first of all, if you look under Canada, Canadian and provincial laws and jurisdiction, 100% that's where Indigenous people were. And that's what you find with the specific laws of the Indian Act and other Canadian and provincial legislation that focuses specifically on Indigenous people. So then you move, you transition to where there are one or more areas of Indigenous self-governance over very specific areas, such as education, health, some of the land claims in terms of the holdings from those agreements. And in some areas there, when I said municipal type structures, was referring to, the Animal Act, or having a policy to be able to say what happens to animals, what the speed limits are in the community. So very much within the community types of laws or policies, bylaws, not policies. So then the transition is to Indigenous self-governance with the Constitution. And right now, there are a number of First Nations who have now gone outside of the Indian Act and have developed their own laws and are in the process of doing so. And so again, this is another step in the progression. And then there is Indigenous self-government with a provincial or territory model. And the example that I gave was Nunavut, under the Nunavut agreement, where they are responsible, similar to a territory, another territory, where they make all the decisions under education and everything for that entire territory. And it includes non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, Inuit people. So I tried to depict it by drawing or creating this, and I'm hoping it gives you a sense that there is a progression, that self-government is something that is important, that is recognized by the Canadian government, and it is under process with Indigenous people. And I'm hoping that I gave you some reasons, support as to why it is important. So common factors within the agreements. So this is part of when self-government is being looked at as part of an agreement. Some of the parameters are that no self-government agreement is possible without approval of the Indigenous people through a community vote. Self-government is negotiated within the Canadian constitutional framework, and federal legislation is passed before the negotiated agreement takes effect. Under self-government, Indigenous laws operate in harmony with federal and provincial laws. Indigenous laws protect culture, language, generally take priority if there's a conflict with the laws. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and other general laws like the Criminal Code continue to apply. Community members and non-member residents on Indigenous land have the input into decisions that directly affect them. So I also have a number of other sources that I have added to this. And at this time, I have completed my presentation, much to my dissatisfaction with some of the other information that I'd hoped to give you. But I'm hoping that the information has been insightful, and I am really open to questions at this time.
All right, thank you for that talk. Pam, I definitely learned some things. I feel like as someone who's been out of school for a while, it's very helpful to kind of have that ground laid, just kind of a baseline, which I found really helpful, a good refresher on a lot of the important points. I wanted to know, and this is just a personal question, as we were going through the self-governance point, what, like you discussed how the Inuit have had from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, the Inuit have had self-governance for much longer than I recognize under the Canadian government, I should preface, than maybe some of the First Nations in the kind of Ontario, Manitoba provinces. And is that correct in that statement? Or is it just because they're one group within a larger space and the groups in Ontario and the other provinces are much more separate, so it just takes longer because there's so many more groups to kind of work through? Or does that make any sense what I'm asking?
So I think that my observation in creating this is that there was more, it looked like there was more in place for the First Nations in terms of the Indian Act, in terms of, the fact that we are registered versus the other two groups being registered by the government. There's registries for them relating to medical records, but in terms of, having a number similar to, my number based on, where I'm from and what community I'm from, and then what number I was given, that isn't as entrenched. The actual governance and governments, the self-governments, those are fairly recent things. And there are groups of First Nations who have opted out of the Indian Act, which means that they are their own governing bodies. That has been in the West Coast, especially. That's gone on for a bit now. But to be able to say which came first in terms of the Nunavut being created as its own territory, with legislation and governance and its own constitution, that is, I'm not sure right now whether which came first. But I think I'm trying to give the idea that the governance, self-governance is something that is evolving, and it is in process, and every negotiation with the government, and this is all very specific to legally binding treaties and agreements that are new with the government. those are what are the base of which, the struggles in the advocacy and the negotiations are, and why the changes are being able to be made at this point. The fact that the government identified in 1982 that we have the right to self-governance did open the doors for those conversations to happen. So I believe it was after all of that, at that time, that all of the self-governance has been starting to be put in place.
Okay, that's good answer. I have a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to start with the first one from Karen. She said, are they looking into dividing the provinces further to allow for First Nations governing, i.e. divided provinces into territories?
So not that I know of. So as it is right now, Northwest Territories became part of Nunavut, and it was in the northern parts of those areas that they were able to create the territories for those 4 regions of the Inuit. And I know that there's a very specific name that I'm apologize that I can't say correctly. But so it wasn't, it is a case of taking or allocating land, but it was the traditional territories of those groups. At this point, I know that they're, as part of land claim agreements, that they're, as part of treaties, for example, there were lands that were promised to very specific First Nations. That's my experience. And they have now been able to expand their land base. But at this point, it has not meant that any private property owned by a Canadian citizen has been taken, absconded with, to give to the Indigenous people. If that has occurred in any case, there would have been remuneration for that. But it is mostly Crown land that has been expanded, and then there's been settlements of that are financial as opposed to the land. So remember, a lot of the treaties, the land base that were promised to Indigenous people were often bigger than what they were, the reserves finally became. So that's a lot of what the struggles are for, is to be able to have the rights as stated under the treaties to be honored. I'm hoping I answered your question.
Karen, if you need any more clarification, just throw it in the chat there. We can talk about it more. Another question I have here that came in from Dave. He said, how long is the history of written Aboriginal language, and how have the different scripts originated?
Writing it down because I'll forget.
That's fair. I tend to blank out when I'm answering questions too. So
it depends on the Indigenous group that you're talking about, because I know that that written language from what my understanding is not something that we as Anishinaabe had. That it was something that we developed, like I know that the Cree have syllabics, for example, and I believe that that was developed since European contact. So to be able to say that we had it, our languages, our communication was written down. I know that there are very old documents that show, that there was communication through visual depictions, but to be able to say that I know that there was a lengthy period of time where we had written language, I am not familiar with any that had it for a very long time. And if I'm wrong, I'm just giving you my experience from my area.
Okay.
What was the question about script?
It said, how have this different scripts originated? It was a two-part question. So the history of the written Aboriginal language, and how the different scripts originated.
So again, script based on my, like it's something that I would have to look into more, but script for me had to do with remuneration under the treaties or as agreements that were received by the Indigenous people. And it was likely on an annual basis. I know about annuities, but I know that I was just reading a book, and it's was written in 1994, and it was talking about the history of one of the First Nations from this area. And it was talking about the fact that originally the Indigenous groups were receiving from the government, they were receiving goods on a regular basis, probably on an annual basis, but I'm not quite sure of that. So the formation of payment was part of the agreement of the treaties. And that's my understanding of what the script is. I would like to come back and give a better answer on that one. But the way that this works, I'm not sure how I can communicate that, but I could look into it.
Okay, all right. And then I have another questions come in from Lori. Said, I have heard of the Gladus court, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, in the justice, court in the justice system. Can you give an example of how it would differ from the existing court system?
So I'm familiar with the Gladue report, but it is not something that I could probably give you a good answer right now in terms of how it is. What was the, I think I can read the question myself.
Oh, this one's on Facebook.
Okay.
So I'll say it again. I have heard of the Gladue court in the justice system. Can you give an example of how it would differ from the existing court system? So I would assume this is in reference to self-governance. Lori, I don't know if you want to clarify that at all, but in terms of the difference maybe in how they would be similar or different between the two systems. If I'm familiar, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this.
Yeah, so I can't answer that right at this particular moment because it wasn't part of this presentation that I prepared for. But I can tell you that the judicial system, so in terms of there's been alternative or diversion type of systems that have been put into place for, and again, I can only speak as a First Nation person, but instead of somebody, for example, who has, for example, had, you know, that there's been violence in a family, that they would, or that there's been some crime that is committed, that somebody has committed on someone else, that instead of it going through a court system, and depending on the type of offense it is, that they would go through diversion, where they would bring an elder, they would try to mediate, having the individuals come to some kind of agreement, you know, the person being able to atone themselves through doing something on behalf of that individual or the community. But in terms of how it would affect the judicial system, I'm not sure at this point. And again, I can come back and provide more information on that. But at this point, I can't answer that. Sorry.
It actually sounds like you kind of drew some similarities between how the process would be compared. So because she does clarify, she's referring to self-governance versus, I guess, the Canadian government judicial system.
What I can tell you is that in the case of self-government and the laws that are going to be made for every community and how they will be doing their processes, it will be based uniquely on themselves for the most part. So that's what I can say. Self-government, and that was one of the things that my slides, I'm so frustrated because I had some really nice stuff in there to be able to talk about, you know, the visions of self-government, but there is going to be, as part of governance, having their own constitution. the ability to be able to say who is their members, to be able to have the right to be able to make very sound decisions about what happens within their First Nations. And it's not a consensus, but I believe it very much has to be the community's support of all of the changes that are going to be coming about as a result of the changes and creation of their own constitutions.
Okay, interesting. So just to clarify that point, you said, so would each band or group make their own interpretation of what self-governance would look like in term within, is that what you mean by it's very individual to like each group? Or
so the steps in self-government, and if you remember my progression graph there, there've been towards having autonomy over and making decisions about things that impact you and your communities. It's been going on to some extent in areas of health, in areas of education for a while. So the idea that they are going to be taking it further to be able to make more decisions about their citizens and their lands and what occurs, in terms of becoming more self-sustaining, and self-dependent, like self-governing, that is a progression that is going to be different, and it is obviously different for all of the Indigenous groups in terms of what their negotiations have been with the government as to what self-government and what are their priorities. So already it's very different across all the groups, all the Indigenous groups, and then the different First Nations who are coming to decisions about becoming having their own constitution.
Okay, that makes sense. Just to pivot right back to Dave's question, he just sent a little note here to clarify. He was referring to, when he meant scripts, he meant, I guess, the different alphabets or yeah, that would go along with the written language of
So again, Dave, as I am familiar, I know that there were written languages, and I talk about my experience of seeing syllabics and seeing a friend of my dad's create it. But I also know that it is something that from my understanding, was more created after European contact. I know that in Anishinaabe, which is Ojibwe, we have adopted the ferric system, which is the double vowels. And again, that is in keeping with, that's new. If you saw Anishinaabe words written, say 25 years ago, it was a little different than it is today. It is something that I think as languages and written, they are evolving, but I believe that it was not necessarily that Indigenous people had written words for us to be able to be, reading on an ongoing basis. We were an oral people and oral traditions. And if I am wrong about because there's so many diverse groups and that there are some who had, my sincere apologies for not knowing that.
Okay, you still answered those questions better than it's pretty well. So, I wanted to, I think we discussed this briefly before, but you're happy to share your presentation. There's been a few comments about some of the references and the informational links that you put in, particularly at the end. So I will, if everyone's okay with this, I will send anyone who signed up through Zoom link, because I have access to your email, I will send you a copy of the slides, as a few people have asked. And then Lori, I will pass along your email to Pam to hopefully you guys can connect and maybe have a bit more of a conversation about some of the specifics you're looking for. She shared her, she would love to chat with you or have more information shared regarding the self-governance and the two different systems and questions. So she shared her email. So I will pass that along to you, Pam, and maybe you guys can have a chat there.
So if I could just add the caveat.
Yeah.
My computer crashed just before this. I went to start it up and I had a black screen. And so I contacted Adrian by my phone to be able to say, my system's, slow in starting. So then when I went to go into my PowerPoint, it's not the one that my final product. And I usually know better to send it to myself, but I was hungry and I went and had supper. So I am going to be sending you not the one that I just gave, but it'll be a little bit more comprehensive, and it was edited. So there's no spelling mistakes in my next one. So that is my commitment, and I hope you don't mind if I give you the other one. I'd feel much better.
I'm sure people will be okay with that, as there'll probably be more information in there than what you already had in your slides here. So if there are no other questions, I don't see anyone else, anything popping up. Thank you so much for those questions. That was great. Like I said, I will connect, I will send everyone, once Pam shares with me her updated presentation, I will forward that on to everyone who was registered through the Zoom link. And if anyone on Facebook would like it, additionally as watching, please just direct message the museum message page, and I will make sure that gets to you. All right, one more thing came through. Okay, so thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm hoping Pam will be back, so please stay tuned through the museum website and our social media pages, where we will be advertising hopefully some other future talks and lectures with her in the future. And thank you all so much. Pam, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I was thinking about if I am going to be coming back to do a presentation, if there are different questions or areas that you would like to know more about, I would certainly be interested in, creating a presentation that, fit your interest and your curiosity.
Well, if anyone has any suggestions or areas that they'd like to look at, please do email the museum. My email is abriggs@niagarafalls.ca, but if you can't remember that, just email the general info email through the museum website if there's anything that anyone is in particular, and I could forward those on to Pam as well. Okay, well, I think that concludes this evening. Thank you everyone so much for tuning in. Thank you for the great questions, and hopefully I will see everyone virtually at some point again in the near future. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Hey, Gretch.
Bye.